I still remember the exact weight of that cherry lip balm in my fingers. How I kept rolling it back and forth, like a nervous habit I'd developed just for that moment. The television was on but muted, casting these pale blue shadows across Caleb's face as he sat on the opposite end of my mother's old sofa. Outside, the summer night pressed against the screen door with that heavy, humid stillness that only comes in July. Crickets hummed their endless song, and somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and fell silent. Caleb had been talking about Nora Martinez for weeks. How she'd smiled at him during chemistry class. How she'd said yes when he finally worked up the courage to ask her to the end of summer dance. How he was terrified he'd mess it up because he'd never actually kissed anyone before. Neither had I, but I didn't say that part out loud. He shifted on the couch, and I caught the scent of his deodorant mixed with something else. Soap, maybe. Or just the particular smell of his skin that I'd memorized without meaning to during all those afternoons we'd spent together that summer. Swimming at the lake, lying on towels in his backyard, close enough that I could count the freckles on his shoulders. Just so I don't screw it up with Nora, he said, and there was this forced casualness in his voice that I recognized because I used it too sometimes. When I was trying to sound like something didn't matter as much as it actually did. You know, practice. The word hung between us like a question neither of us wanted to answer directly. Practice. As if what was about to happen was just preparation for something else, something more important, something real. But even then, even at 17, I think I knew that wasn't entirely true. I set the lip balm down on the coffee table. My hands were shaking slightly, and I hoped he couldn't see. The living room felt smaller than usual, like the walls had drawn closer while we weren't paying attention. The ceiling fan turned lazy circles overhead, stirring the warm air, but not really cooling anything. When he leaned toward me, I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way they darted away and then back to my face. We were both awkward at first, the way teenagers are when they're trying to figure out where noses go and how to breathe at the same time. His lips were softer than I'd expected, and they tasted faintly of the Coke we'd been sharing earlier. But then something changed. What was supposed to be quick, perfunctory, became something else entirely. Caleb didn't pull away like we'd planned. Instead, he seemed to melt closer, and my hand, which had only meant to touch his shoulder for balance, found its way to the base of his neck. His skin was warm there, and I could feel his pulse beating fast against my fingertips. The room fell completely silent except for the steady tick of the old wall clock my mother had inherited from her mother, and the gentle whir of the ceiling fan above us. Even the crickets seemed to pause. Time stretched and compressed all at once, and for those few moments, the rest of the world simply disappeared. Then, suddenly, he jerked back. Not violently, but definitively, like someone had called his name from another room. He sat there for a moment, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not angry exactly, not embarrassed, just different. Like he was seeing something in my face that he hadn't expected to find there. Or maybe like he was seeing himself reflected back in a way that surprised him. "We should go to sleep," he said, and his voice sounded strange, distant. He stood up without looking at me again and walked down the hall toward the guest room where he'd been staying for the weekend. His footsteps were careful and quiet, like he was trying not to wake someone, even though we were the only ones in the house. I stayed on the couch for a long time after that, listening to the sounds of him settling into bed in the next room. The creak of springs, the rustle of sheets, the small sigh he made when he finally lay still. My heart was still racing, and I kept touching my lips, trying to understand what had just happened. Outside, the night continued its summer song. But inside, everything had changed, and I was left alone with the weight of something I couldn't yet name. 19 years later, I still use the same chipped mug for my morning coffee. It's white ceramic with a faded blue rim, something my mother picked up at a church rummage sale when I was in middle school. She's been gone for 3 years now, but I can't bring myself to replace it. Some mornings, when the light hits it just right on the kitchen counter, I can almost see her hands wrapped around it, steam rising between her fingers as she read the local paper and hummed something under her breath. I am 36 years old, and I live in the house where I grew up. The same house where Caleb and I shared that kiss all those summers ago. People in town think it's sweet that I moved back to take care of my mother during her final months. What they don't understand is that I never really left, not in any way that mattered. Even when I was away at college, even during those few years I spent teaching in Boston, this place held me with invisible threads. My students at the high school know me as Mr. Emerson. Reliable, they say. The teacher who stays late to help with essays, who remembers their names years after graduation, who speaks quietly but somehow commands attention. I've been teaching here for 8 years now, long enough to have taught the younger siblings of some of my first students. Long enough to become part of the fabric of this small Massachusetts town where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are hard to keep but easy to avoid discussing. The other faculty members have stopped asking about my personal life, mostly. At first, there were gentle inquiries. Set-up attempts with sisters and cousins and friends from neighboring towns. But I perfected a particular smile, polite and appreciative but final, and eventually they learned to recognize it. Now they just assume I'm one of those people who's married to their work, devoted to their students, content with solitude. They're not entirely wrong. My house is full of ghosts, though not the supernatural kind. In my old bedroom, now my office, there are still notebooks from high school tucked away in the closet. Essays I wrote about books that changed me. Poems I never showed anyone. Phone numbers written on scraps of paper, including Caleb's, though that one hasn't been current for over a decade. In the living room, my mother's piano sits against the far wall, its keys yellowed and untouched. She used to play hymns on Sunday mornings, filling the house with music that made even mundane moments feel sacred. In the attic, there are boxes labeled in my mother's careful handwriting. Grant College, with a question mark, as if even then she wasn't sure I'd really go. Grant, childhood, filled with report cards and art projects and a few photographs from summer camp. I haven't opened that one since I moved back. Some ghosts are better left undisturbed. My days follow a pattern that has become as natural as breathing. Coffee in the chipped mug while I read emails on my phone. The same route to work, past the lake where I learned to swim, past the elementary school I attended, past the church where my mother's funeral was held. Faculty meetings where I sit in the same chair and contribute thoughtfully, but not too often. Afternoons in my classroom, door propped open, helping students navigate the complexity of literature that mirrors their own complicated lives. Evenings are the hardest part. The house settles around me with small sounds. The refrigerator humming. The old wooden floors creaking as they cool. The distant sound of traffic on the main road. People going somewhere else. People with somewhere to be. I correct papers at the kitchen table until the red ink starts to blur together, and then I allow myself what I've come to think of as my weakness. I scroll through social media with the kind of deliberate casualness that fools no one, least of all myself. I tell myself I'm just curious about old friends, just checking in on people from my past. But I'm looking for one person in particular, and we both know it. His profile isn't private. Caleb Morrison, married to a woman named Jennifer who has kind eyes and straight teeth, and looks exactly like the type of person who would make a good mother. Their children are 7 and 5 now, a boy and a girl with his dark hair and her smile. The photos are the kind that make you believe in happiness. Beach vacations and birthday parties and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that somehow look magical through the filter of a phone camera. There's one photograph I return to more often than I should. It was taken last summer at a lake that might be the same one where we used to swim, though I can't be sure. Caleb is standing in shallow water, his son on his shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. His wife and daughter are building a sandcastle on the shore. The late afternoon light turns everything golden, and everyone looks exactly where they belong. I study his face in these pictures, looking for traces of the 17-year-old boy who kissed me in my living room with such unexpected tenderness. The boy who pulled away like he'd been burned, who left the next morning with barely a goodbye and avoided me for the rest of that summer. I can still see him there, in the way Caleb's eyes crinkle when he smiles, in the particular way he tilts his head when he's concentrating on something. But he looks settled now, complete, like a man who has built exactly the life he intended to build, with no loose threads or unfinished conversations. I close the app, set my phone aside, and return to grading papers or reading or preparing lessons for the next day. I go to bed at a reasonable hour and sleep soundly, mostly. I wake up and make coffee in the same chipped mug, and the cycle begins again. People assume I'm lonely, and sometimes they're right. But loneliness isn't quite the right word for what I feel. It's more like living with a constant awareness of absence. The shape of something that was never quite there, but somehow still left an impression. Like pressing your hand into wet sand and then watching the waves smooth it away, but being able to feel the memory of pressure long after the evidence disappears. At weddings and baby showers and retirement parties, people still ask if there's anyone special in my life. I've perfected my response over the years. A small smile, a gentle shake of my head, a redirection of the conversation back to the person asking. Most people respect the boundary. They assume I'm shy or particular, or perhaps nursing some old heartbreak they're too polite to investigate. They're not wrong about the heartbreak part, but it's not old exactly. It's more like something that never quite happened, which somehow makes it impossible to heal from completely. You can't get over something that never officially began, but you can't forget it either. So I live quietly, and mostly contentedly, in the spaces between words. In the pauses between questions I don't want to answer. In the gap between who I am and who I might have been if I'd been braver. Or if he had been. Or if the world had been different when we were 17 and discovering that some kinds of practice can change you forever. The letter arrives on a Thursday in early April, mixed in with the usual collection of bills and grocery store circulars that fill my mailbox. I almost miss it entirely, this cream-colored envelope with my name written in handwriting I recognize but can't immediately place. The return address says Noah Chun, and underneath it, an address in Vermont I've never seen before. I stand at the end of my driveway, sorting through the mail with half my attention while my neighbor's dog barks at a squirrel in the maple tree that overhangs our property line. It's one of those perfect spring afternoons where the air smells like possibilities and the light has that particular clarity that makes everything seem more vivid than it actually is. The kind of day that used to make me restless when I was younger, like I should be doing something more significant than grading papers and planning lessons. Noah Chun. The name tugs at something in my memory, and then it clicks. The art counselor from Silver Lake Summer Camp. The guy with paint-stained fingers who taught us to see light differently. Who convinced a cabin full of teenage boys that there was nothing embarrassing about caring whether a sunset was beautiful. He must be in his 50s now, probably has kids of his own, maybe grandchildren. Inside the house, I set the other mail aside and open his letter carefully. The paper is heavy, expensive feeling, the kind people use for important announcements. Wedding invitations, graduation ceremonies, things that mark the passage of time. Silver Lake Summer Camp. It says across the top in elegant script, 20-year reunion. I have to read that twice. 20 years. Has it really been that long since I was 17? Since that final summer when everything changed and nothing was ever quite the same afterward? The math is simple enough, but somehow the number feels impossible. 20 years since I last walked those pine-shaded trails, since I last dove off the old dock into water, so clear you could see straight to the bottom. 20 years since Caleb and I sat in that supply shed during a thunderstorm, close enough to touch, but not quite brave enough to try. The letter itself is brief and cheerful, full of exclamation points and memories I'd forgotten I still carried. Noah mentions the old dining hall, the rope swing that's apparently still hanging from the oak tree by the water, the fire pit where we used to gather for evening stories. He talks about people I haven't thought about in years. Counselors who became teachers, campers who became doctors and lawyers and parents. He doesn't mention Caleb specifically, but somehow his name seems to hover between every line. I fold the letter and set it on the kitchen counter, next to the stack of papers I was planning to grade tonight. Through the window, I can see my neighbor's children playing in their backyard, their voices carrying on the warm air. Their laughter is bright and uncomplicated, the kind of joy that exists only when you haven't yet learned to second-guess every impulse. For the rest of the week, I ignore the invitation. It sits there on my counter like a question I'm not ready to answer, shuffled between coffee mugs and grocery lists and the ordinary debris of daily life. I tell myself I'm too busy to think about summer camp reunions, too settled in my routines to consider disrupting them for a weekend of nostalgia with people I barely remember. But that's not entirely true, and I know it. The truth is that Caleb will probably be there. Of course he will. He was always more social than I was, more likely to maintain connections, more comfortable with the idea that the past could be revisited without consequence. And the thought of seeing him again, of trying to make small talk about our separate lives while pretending we don't both remember what happened in my living room all those years ago, fills me with a particular kind of dread. The last time I saw him was maybe 10 years ago, in the cereal aisle of the grocery store in the next town over. I was reaching for a box of something healthy and boring when I heard someone say my name. I turned around, and there he was, looking older but unmistakably himself, wearing a Red Sox t-shirt and holding a shopping basket filled with the kind of food that suggested he was cooking for more than one person. We talked for maybe 5 minutes. Surface things. How's work? How's life? He mentioned his wife, his kids, his job at a construction company that specialized in historic renovation. I talked about teaching, about moving back to take care of my mother. We both smiled too much and made eye contact too little, and when we finally said goodbye, he clapped me on the shoulder in that particular way men do when they want to show affection but don't know how. "Take care of yourself, Grant," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been fondness or regret, or just the automatic warmth you extend to someone who used to matter to you in a way that's too complicated to explain. I watched him walk away, his cart squeaking slightly on the linoleum floor, and I stood there in the cereal aisle for longer than was reasonable, holding that box of something healthy and boring and wondering what might have been different if I'd been brave enough to say what I was actually thinking. But this invitation feels different somehow, more deliberate, like an opportunity that won't come again. On Sunday evening, I find myself standing in front of the calendar that hangs on my refrigerator, the one my mother gave me 3 Christmases ago with photographs of New England lighthouses. The reunion is scheduled for the first weekend in July, circled now in pencil because I'm still not entirely sure I'll go through with this. The sensible thing would be to decline politely. Send Noah a note thanking him for thinking of me, but explaining that I have other commitments, other plans, other places I need to be. It would be easier, certainly. Safer. I could spend that weekend grading summer school assignments or reading in my backyard or doing any of the dozen quiet activities that have become the comfortable shape of my life. But standing there in my kitchen, looking at that penciled circle on the calendar, I remember something Noah used to say during art class when we were frustrated with a painting that wasn't turning out the way we'd envisioned. Sometimes you have to risk ruining something to make it beautiful, he'd tell us. Sometimes the only way forward is through. 3 weeks later, I'm driving north through New Hampshire toward the Vermont border, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly and my stomach doing things that remind me of being 17 again. The drive takes 4 hours, winding through small towns and past lakes that all look vaguely familiar, as if I've been here before in dreams I can't quite remember. Silver Lake Summer Camp looks smaller than it did in my memory, the way childhood places always do. The wooden buildings are weathered now, their red paint faded to something closer to rust, but the bones of the place are exactly as I left them. The dining hall with its screened porch, the arts and crafts building with its north-facing windows, the dock stretching out into water that's so still it looks like glass. I park in the gravel lot next to cars I don't recognize, and for a moment I consider turning around and driving home. No one would know I'd been here. I could make up some excuse about traffic or a family emergency or sudden illness. I could preserve the careful distance I've built between myself and this place, between myself and all the complicated feelings it represents. But then I see him. Caleb is sitting on the railing of the main lodge porch, one leg bent, the other dangling, looking out at the lake with the kind of easy stillness that suggests he's been there for a while. He's wearing jeans and a blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his hair is shorter than it was in high school, but still dark, still falling across his forehead in that particular way I remember. Even from across the parking lot, even after all these years, I would know the line of his shoulders anywhere. He turns when he hears my car door slam, and our eyes meet across 20 years and a dozen careful conversations and all the words we never said to each other. For a moment, the world contracts to just this. The space between us. The weight of recognition. The way his face changes when he realizes it's me. Surprise giving way to something I can't quite name. He raises his hand in a small wave, and despite everything, despite all my careful plans and reasonable fears, I find myself smiling as I walk toward the lodge where it all began. The reunion stretches across 3 days, and by Saturday morning, I've fallen into the strange rhythm of pretending that 20 years haven't passed. The mess hall still smells like pancake syrup and pine sap, and when I close my eyes during breakfast, I can almost hear the ghost of teenage laughter echoing off the wooden walls. People drift back into old patterns with surprising ease. The athletes gravitate toward the lake for swimming races and canoe competitions. The theater kids organize impromptu skits around the evening campfire. I find myself with the quieter group, the ones who preferred art class and nature walks, sitting on the screened porch with coffee that's too weak and stories that feel both foreign and familiar. Caleb moves through it all like he belongs here, which maybe he does. He always had that gift for making himself at home anywhere, for finding the right thing to say to the right person at the right moment. I watch him from across conversations, noting the way his laugh lines have deepened, how his hands gesture when he talks about his work restoring old houses, how he listens to people with the same careful attention he gave to everything when we were 17. We exchange pleasantries when our paths cross. He asks about my teaching, and I ask about his family. Safe territory. The kind of conversation you might have with any acquaintance from your past. But there's something underneath it, a current of awareness that makes every casual interaction feel slightly electric. On Saturday afternoon, I find myself walking alone on the trail that leads around the back of the lake. It's the same path we used to take during nature photography sessions, winding through stands of white pine and birch trees that filter the sunlight into scattered coins of gold. The air smells like summer and memory, that particular combination of warm earth and lake water that I haven't experienced in years. I'm surprised when I hear footsteps behind me and turn to see Caleb catching up, slightly out of breath from walking fast to close the distance between us. "Mind if I join you?" he asks, and there's something in his voice that suggests this isn't entirely coincidence. We walk in comfortable silence for a while, our feet finding the rhythm of the uneven trail. Occasionally, one of us will comment on something we remember. The fallen log where we used to sit during rest breaks. The clearing where we once spotted a deer with her fawn. The overlook where Noah taught us about the quality of light at different times of day. That evening, we end up sitting together on the old lifeguard dock as the sun sets over the water. Other people drift by, but somehow we've carved out this small pocket of privacy in the middle of all the reunion chaos. We skip stones, though neither of us is particularly good at it anymore. My rocks sink after 2 or 3 hops. His do slightly better. We talk about surface things, carefully neutral topics. He tells me about the Victorian house he's been restoring for the past 2 years, how satisfying it is to bring something back to its original beauty. I tell him about my students, how they surprise me sometimes with their insights into books I've been teaching for years. But underneath the safe conversation, there's something else building. A tension that feels familiar and dangerous and entirely too complicated for a summer evening by the lake. Sunday night brings thunderstorms, the kind that roll across New England with sudden violence and dramatic flair. Most people retreat to their cabins early, but I find myself drawn to the old supply shed at the edge of the camp, partly for shelter and partly for the strange comfort of being in a space that holds so many memories. The shed is smaller than I remembered, filled with the same musty smell of life preservers and forgotten summers. Rain pounds against the metal roof with increasing intensity, and through the small window, I can see lightning illuminating the lake in brief, stark moments. I'm standing there, listening to the storm and thinking about all the ways the past refuses to stay buried, when the door opens and Caleb steps inside, shaking water from his hair. "Crazy night," he says, but he doesn't look surprised to find me here. We stand there in the dim space, surrounded by shadows and the sound of rain, and suddenly the careful distance we've been maintaining feels impossible to sustain. The air between us seems charged with more than just the electrical energy of the storm. You ever think about it? He asks quietly, and I know immediately what he means. That night on the couch. The kiss that was supposed to be practice, but became something else entirely. I don't answer right away, partly because I don't need to and partly because I'm not sure I trust my voice to stay steady. I do, he continues, and his words fall into the space between us like stones dropped into still water. More than I should. More than makes sense. The rain intensifies, drumming against the roof with renewed force, and in that small, enclosed space, surrounded by the ghosts of who we used to be, something shifts. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a subtle rearrangement of possibilities, like tumblers falling into place in a lock that's been waiting 20 years to be opened. We don't move closer. We don't touch. But the distance between us feels charged now, humming with the weight of everything we've never said and all the time we've spent not saying it. Monday night arrives with the kind of clarity that only comes after storms. The air has been washed clean, and everything gleams with residual moisture that catches the last light of day like scattered diamonds. The final evening of the reunion feels different from the others, weighted with endings and the knowledge that tomorrow we'll all return to our separate lives. The closing bonfire is a camp tradition, apparently. Something Noah instituted years ago to give people a proper goodbye, a chance to share stories and promises to keep in touch that we probably won't keep. The fire pit sits in a clearing between the dining hall and the lake, surrounded by benches made from split logs that have been here so long they've taken on the silvered color of driftwood. I arrive early and claim a spot with a clear view of the water, partly because I've always liked watching firelight dance on dark surfaces and partly because it gives me an excuse to avoid too much eye contact with people who want to reminisce about shared experiences I'm not sure I remember the same way they do. The fire catches quickly, sending sparks spiraling up toward the first stars. People gather in the familiar constellation of summer camp, socializing. Couples sit close together, sharing private jokes and casual touches. The single people arrange themselves in loose groups, conversations flowing from serious to silly and back again. Someone has brought a guitar, and there's talk of singing the old camp songs, though no one seems eager to actually start. Caleb arrives when the fire is at its brightest, the flames throwing dancing shadows across his face as he scans the circle looking for an empty space. Our eyes meet across the fire, and he nods toward a gap in the group near where I'm sitting. I shift over to make room, hyper-aware of the way his shoulder brushes mine as he settles onto the log. We sit like that for the better part of an hour, listening to other people's stories, occasionally adding our own small contributions to conversations about shared memories and the strange passage of time. Someone talks about the summer a bear wandered into camp. Someone else remembers the year it rained for 6 straight days, and we had to hold all the activities indoors. The stories blur together into a collective narrative of summers that feel both distant and immediate. But I'm finding it hard to concentrate on anything except the warmth radiating from Caleb's body beside me. The way he occasionally glances in my direction when he thinks I'm not paying attention. The fact that neither of us has mentioned what happened in the supply shed during the storm. As the evening progresses and the fire burns lower, people begin to drift away. Early flights tomorrow, long drives, children who need to be picked up from babysitters. The circle grows smaller, conversations quieter, until finally there are only a handful of us left, and the silence between words stretches longer and feels more comfortable. Noah stands up and stretches, announcing that he should probably make sure the dining hall is locked up for the night. A few others follow his lead, gathering their sweaters and water bottles and making their goodnights. Within minutes, it's just Caleb and me sitting by the dying fire. The only sounds the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant call of a loon somewhere across the lake. I should say something, I think, or get up and follow the others back to the cabins, or suggest we bank the fire and call it a night. Instead, I sit perfectly still, acutely aware of every small sound and movement, as if the entire world has narrowed to this moment, this place, this person beside me. Want to walk down to the lake? Caleb asks finally, and his voice is soft enough that I have to lean slightly toward him to hear it clearly. The dock extends 20 feet out into the water, its weathered planks silvered by moonlight and worn smooth by decades of bare feet and summer afternoons. We walk to the end and sit with our legs dangling over the edge, our feet just above the water's surface. The lake stretches out before us like black glass, reflecting stars that seem impossibly bright and close. Remember when they made us practice CPR out here? I say, because silence feels too heavy and I need something to break it that isn't too loaded with meaning. You were terrible at it, he replies, and I can hear the smile in his voice. You kept forgetting the rescue breathing part. I was not terrible. I was thorough. You were terrified you'd have to put your mouth on someone. The words hang between us, and we both realize at the same time what he's just said, how it connects to everything we've been carefully not talking about. The casual teasing falters, and we fall back into silence, but it's different now. Charged. Minutes pass. Maybe 10, maybe 20. Time feels elastic out here, stretched and compressed by the weight of everything we're not saying. Finally, I find the courage to ask the question that's been sitting in my chest like a stone for 20 years. Do you regret not asking me to stay? I say, the words coming out quieter than I intended. That morning, after. He doesn't answer immediately, and when he does, his voice breaks slightly, like something inside him is cracking open. I did ask, he says, just not out loud. The admission settles between us like a physical thing, real and solid and impossible to take back. I turn to look at him, really look at him, and see that 17-year-old boy overlaid on this 40-year-old man. The same eyes that held mine in my living room all those summers ago. The same mouth that kissed me like it meant something and then spent 20 years pretending it didn't. The kiss, when it happens, is nothing like the one we shared when we were teenagers. There's no hesitation, no pretense that this is practice for something else. It's deliberate and slow and full of all the years we've spent not kissing, all the conversations we never had, all the what-ifs and might-have-beens that have lived in the spaces between our ordinary lives. His hand finds the back of my neck, fingers threading through my hair, and I remember how perfectly this gesture fit 20 years ago, how right it felt then, and how impossible it seemed that something so natural could also be so forbidden. Now there's no one to forbid anything, no parents sleeping down the hall, no unspoken rules about what 17-year-old boys are supposed to want. When we finally break apart, we don't move away from each other. We sit there breathing in the space between us, foreheads almost touching, eyes closed. The night continues around us, unaware that anything has changed, but I know with absolute certainty that everything has. This changes everything, I whisper, though I'm not sure if I'm talking to him or to myself. He opens his eyes then, and I see my own reflection in them, distorted but recognizable. I know, he says. And we sit there on the dock where we once learned to save each other's lives. Two men who are no longer young, no longer naive about the complications that love can bring, watching the moon trace its path across the water and understanding that there's no going back from this moment, no pretending it was practice, no waking up tomorrow and acting like it never happened. The night air moves around us, carrying the scent of pine and water and the faintest trace of wood smoke from the dying fire. Somewhere in the distance, that loon calls again, and its cry seems to echo everything we've never been able to say. The drive home from Silver Lake takes exactly 4 hours, but it feels like crossing between two different worlds. By the time I pull into my driveway, the reunion already seems like something I might have dreamed, except for the way my lips still remember the pressure of his mouth against mine and the faint scent of wood smoke that clings to my sweater. I carry my duffel bag into the house and set it by the washing machine, then stand in my kitchen making coffee in the same chipped mug, following the same routine I've maintained for years. But something fundamental has shifted. The house feels different around me, like the walls have rearranged themselves slightly while I was away. The silence isn't comfortable anymore. It's expectant. Tuesday morning, I return to work and smile at my colleagues' questions about my weekend away. I tell them it was nice to see old friends, that the camp looked smaller than I remembered, that the weather was beautiful except for Sunday night storm. All true things that somehow feel like lies because they don't contain the part that matters. But I find myself unable to settle back into my old patterns. For years, I've stayed late in my classroom, grading papers until the red ink becomes a blur and the janitor's footsteps echo in empty hallways. Now I pack up at reasonable hours and drive home, taking a new route that winds past the small lake where I learned to swim as a child. I park there sometimes and sit on a bench that faces the water, not thinking about anything in particular, just watching the light change as evening approaches. At home, I find myself drawn to my mother's piano. I haven't touched the keys in months, maybe years, but now I sit on the worn bench and press middle C with my index finger. The note hangs in the air, clear and true, and I remember how music used to fill this house on Sunday mornings, how it made even ordinary moments feel sacred. I don't play anything complicated, just scales and simple melodies from memory, exercises my mother taught me when I was 10 years old and convinced that piano lessons were punishment rather than privilege. But the sound feels important somehow, like I'm filling a silence that's been waiting too long to be filled. Meanwhile, 60 miles away, Caleb returns to his own carefully constructed life. I imagine him walking through the front door of his colonial-style house, hugging his children, asking about their weekend with their grandmother. I picture him at the dinner table, listening to his daughter talk about her swimming lessons and his son describe the baseball game they watched on television while he was away. I wonder if his wife notices the change immediately, or if it creeps up on her slowly. The way he stares out the kitchen window while she's talking about their neighbor's new fence. How he seems to be listening to something she can't hear. The fact that he started taking longer showers, as if he's trying to wash away something that won't come clean. 3 weeks pass before the phone call comes. It's a Thursday evening in late July, and I'm sitting at the piano working through a simple Bach piece when my phone rings. I almost don't answer because I'm so rarely that anyone calls except telemarketers and the occasional automated reminder about dentist appointments or overdue library books. But something makes me look at the screen, and when I see his name, my heart does something complicated in my chest. His voice, when I answer, sounds different. Steadier than I've ever heard it, but also fragile, like glass that's been strengthened by careful heating. I told her, he says, without preamble, without small talk, without any of the careful distance we've maintained in every conversation we've had as adults. I don't respond immediately because I'm not sure what response he's looking for, and because the weight of those 3 words seems to require careful handling. The line hums softly between us, filled with digital static and everything we've never been able to say to each other. I'm not asking you to fix me, he continues, and I can hear him choosing each word deliberately, like someone building something delicate that might collapse if the foundation isn't perfect. I'm just finally telling the truth. After we hang up, I sit at the piano for another hour, not playing, just thinking about truth and the different ways it can reshape a life. About courage and the price it demands from everyone it touches. About the space between what we want and what we're brave enough to reach for. The letters begin arriving the following week. Handwritten on cream-colored paper that matches the reunion invitation, my name spelled out in Caleb's careful script across the front of each envelope. There's no return address, but I know they're from him before I open the first one. They're not love letters, exactly, though love threads through them like a current underneath the surface of everything else. They're more like an accounting. Pages and pages of memories I'd forgotten he still carried. The time we built a raft out of logs and rope that sank before we could climb aboard. The afternoon we hiked to the top of Mount Sentinel and spent an hour talking about what we wanted to be when we grew up. Neither of us brave enough to admit that what we really wanted was to find a way to stay exactly where we were, with each other, forever. He writes about his marriage without bitterness, describing Jennifer as a good person who deserves better than someone who's been living half a life. He writes about his children with the fierce protectiveness of a father who's trying to navigate divorce while minimizing the damage to the people he loves most. He writes about his work, his small apartment in the next town over, the strange freedom of finally being honest about who he is after 20 years of careful pretense. The letters arrive every few days, sometimes daily. I keep them in a shoebox in my bedroom closet, though I know most of them by heart after the second reading. He never asks for responses, never suggests that this correspondence requires anything from me except the willingness to receive it. But I find myself composing replies in my head while I grade papers or prepare lessons or lie awake at night listening to the house settle around me. By September, the letters have become part of my routine. I check the mailbox with the same anticipation I once reserved for Christmas mornings or report cards that might contain better grades than I'd dared to hope for. When 3 days pass without one, I worry that something has changed, that he's decided this careful relationship we've built through paper and ink is too complicated to sustain. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, I come home from school to find a pickup truck in my driveway. I recognize it immediately, though I've only seen it once before, in the parking lot at Silver Lake. Dark blue, slightly dented on the passenger side, with Massachusetts plates and a bumper sticker that advertises some local business I don't recognize. But it's the figure standing beside it that makes my breath catch in my throat. Caleb looks exactly like he did at the reunion and completely different. His hair is longer, touches his collar now in a way that makes him look younger. He's wearing jeans and a flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves, work boots that have seen serious use. But it's his face that's changed most dramatically. The careful guardedness that I've known him to carry since we were 17 is gone, replaced by something I can only describe as openness. Like he's finally stopped bracing himself against some blow that never came. He sees me pull into the driveway and raises one hand in a small wave, the gesture tentative but not apologetic. When I get out of my car, we stand there looking at each other across 10 feet of autumn air that smells like wood smoke and dying leaves, two men who are no longer pretending to be anything other than exactly who they are. He looks terrified, standing there beside his truck with his hands shoved deep in his pockets and his shoulders slightly hunched against the October chill. But he also looks free. 6 months later, we have developed what I can only call a routine, though that word feels too mundane for something that has quietly rearranged the entire architecture of my life. Every Saturday morning, I drive to the lake where I learned to swim as a child, the same one I started visiting during those restless weeks after the reunion. Caleb meets me there at 9 o'clock, usually arriving a few minutes before I do, already unfolding 2 aluminum chairs on the small patch of grass that overlooks the water. The chairs are nothing special, the kind you might buy at any hardware store for camping trips or backyard barbecues. But they've become sacred to me in the way that ordinary objects sometimes do when they witness extraordinary things. We bring coffee in travel mugs that we've learned to prepare exactly the way the other person likes it. His is black with 1 sugar. Mine has cream, but no sweetener. Small details that feel monumental when you've spent 20 years not knowing them. Some Saturdays we talk about work, about his children who are adjusting to the new rhythm of divorced parents with more grace than either of us probably deserves. About my students and their essays that surprise me with their insight into books I've been teaching for years. About the small dramas and satisfactions that fill the spaces between larger events. Other Saturdays we sit in comfortable silence, watching the water change color as clouds move across the sky, listening to the sounds that lakes make when the world is quiet enough to hear them. The gentle lapping of small waves against the shore. The call of red-winged blackbirds in the cattails. The distant hum of a boat motor somewhere across the water. Caleb lives in a rented apartment now, a 2-bedroom place in the next town over that he describes as temporary, though he's been there long enough to hang pictures on the walls and plant herbs in pots on the small balcony. His children stay with him every other weekend and one night during the week, a schedule that he's learning to navigate with the careful attention of someone who understands that love, especially parental love, requires constant calibration. We don't live together. We haven't discussed it directly, but I think we both understand that some things can't be rushed, that the slow building of trust requires patience and space and the freedom to choose each other new every day. There's something precious about the deliberateness of our Saturday mornings, the way we both have to make the conscious decision to show up, to unfold the chairs, to share the quiet hour before the world fully awakens. But there are other times too. Thursday evenings when he stops by after work, his truck rumbling into my driveway, just as the afternoon light is beginning to slant through the kitchen windows. Sunday dinners that stretch into early evening. Both of us moving around my mother's kitchen with the kind of easy coordination that develops between people who are learning each other's rhythms. Sometimes he stays over, sleeping in my bed with the unself-conscious comfort of someone who has finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. I wake up on those mornings to find him already dressed and making coffee in the chipped mug that has become his, humming something under his breath in a way that fills the house with the same kind of music my mother used to make. His divorce was finalized in December, processed through a legal system that has no vocabulary for the particular complexity of a marriage that ended not because of cruelty or indifference, but because one person finally found the courage to stop pretending to be someone they weren't. Jennifer handled it with a dignity that humbles me, accepting his honesty with the kind of grace that suggests she'd suspected the truth long before he found the words to say it. I keep a photograph in my wallet now, tucked behind my driver's license where I see it every time I pay for coffee or hand over my ID at the library. It's not from summer camp or high school, not one of those sepia-toned artifacts of who we used to be. Someone took it last month during one of our Saturday mornings at the lake, probably without us noticing. In the picture, we're both looking out at the water, not at the camera, not at each other, but towards some point on the horizon that exists beyond the frame. Caleb's hands are wrapped around his coffee mug, and I'm leaning slightly forward in my chair, as if I'm listening to something important. We look exactly like what we are, two middle-aged men who have found something worth sitting still for. It's not a love story we share with many people. My colleagues know that I'm seeing someone, and occasionally Caleb will stop by the school at the end of the day to walk with me to my car. But we don't make announcements or grand gestures or declarations about the future that neither of us can predict with certainty. What we have instead is this: Saturday mornings by the water, Thursday evenings in my kitchen, Sunday dinners that taste better when prepared by 4 hands instead of 2. The particular comfort of sleeping next to someone whose breathing you've memorized, whose presence makes even the deepest quiet feel full instead of empty. It's not the love story either of us imagined when we were 17 and thought that wanting something was the same thing as knowing how to have it. But it's ours, finally and fully ours, built slowly and carefully out of Saturday mornings and second chances and the radical act of telling the truth after 20 years of living around it. And perhaps most importantly, it's real.